Right, today I'm in a pod at the top of the Vivo building, the home of the Racing Post, with Tom Kerr. Thanks for joining us today, Tom.
Pleasure.
We keep checking around to make sure we're not going to blow away with Hurricane Elena, so remains buffering us, but anyway, we'll see how we go. Right, Tom, you seem to be the go-to journalist at the Racing Post for sort of stirring things up in the community. Are you not frightened of upsetting members of the racing elite, and are you happy with that role, if indeed that is your role?
Well, I never set out purposely to upset anyone. That's not why I do what I do, but as a journalist my job is to cover stories which I think are relevant, thought-provoking, or just curious, frankly, and sometimes that does mean that issues get raised which some people would rather not be raised, but you know, I neither apologise for that nor revel in it. I'm not looking to annoy anyone, but if it takes annoying someone to raise a crucial issue, then that's my job and I've got to do it.
Well, that job now is, as we all know, at the Racing Post. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into racing, and how you sort of arrived at where we are now?
Sure thing, yeah. I grew up in Glasgow and don't really have a racing connection in the family, aside from remembering very distantly when I was a wee kid getting taken along a couple of times to the races by my grandfather. But I always bet in the Grand National. That was the one thing that I had every year. And I'd always, you know, wake up on Grand National Day and be really excited about the you know, the pin stickers pages in your paper, and going down looking at all the exotic names and the colours and reading the star ratings, and eventually picking out my sort of 50p each way, which my mum would go and put on at the bookies. And I don't think I ever backed the winner until number 6 Valverde, and by which point I was maybe 18 then or something like that. So fairly long time waiting for that first winner, but I had a tenner on. I think it came in at 12 or 14 to 1, and won 120, 140 pounds. And I was from that moment I sort of went from being someone who enjoyed racing once a year to being someone who suddenly started becoming aware of the endless sort of complexities and excitement that came with the sport, and from there I sort of got into the rest of jumps racing. And not too long after that, or around that time, is also when Kauto Star came to prominence. And I was at university when he was in his pomp, and I was his biggest fan. Sort of backed him to a stupid degree every time he ran, and was just absolutely in love with the horse. You know, carried around newspaper clippings in my wallet and everything. And so number 6 Valverde and then Kauto Star were the two horses which really sort of launched my my interest in racing.
So then what did you train to be a journalist, and then you just focused on the Racing Post? Is that how it worked?
Pretty much. I didn't study journalism, but I did sort of get involved in student journalism. I actually did a lot of music journalism rather than sports journalism, which is not too glamorous at the university level. It's mainly sort of going down to watch the field hockey team at 7 AM in the morning, whereas I went to see you know, Franz Ferdinand playing to 200 people. But by the time I got to the end of my university time at university, I was absolutely sure I wanted to go into journalism. And basically I was very fortunate to come across the BHA do a graduate scheme, and through that I could get a placement at the PA or the Racing Post. And I thought, what an opportunity this to combine two things that I really enjoy, racing and journalism, and was fortunate enough to get on the course and did my placement at the PA in Howden, which is near Hull, and after that came down to London, managed to get a spot at the Racing Post as a work experience sort of flunky, and the rest is history.
So how long ago was that?
That was 9 years ago. 9 years ago I came down to London.
So one of the articles that, you know, caused a fair bit of debate was your article about Kempton Park being a travesty closing. When you look back at that article, was that correct? And do you still think it is now, or was it just a way to play to the crowd and sort of make your name a bit, when really the track is totally gone?
Well, first of all, I mean, to take the simple fact that they're talking about closing a sports venue which is valued, and it might only be seriously valued once a year, but it's still got a real important place in the sort of cultural, historical, sporting heritage of racing with the King George. And I think anytime developers sort of get their claws into something like that and they want to shut it down in order to make a big whopping profit by building more identical houses, I think that's very sad. And I think we've seen that, you know, across society, whether it's sporting venues, whether it's music, cultural, you know, we're seeing all the places which make communities unique, which are valuable to people, shutting down and being replaced by houses, by things which don't really add any sort of complexity or value to people's lives. And I think that's really sad, and I think it's beholden on anyone who cares about these places to stand up and say, no, this is the wrong thing to do. Whether is Kempton itself, is it failing right now? I think without doubt Kempton is one of the most underutilised racecourses in British racing. You know, they put on countless low-grade all-weather meetings, and they put them on for paltry crowds, and it can often be quite sort of grim when you're there, and that's a real shame, because Kempton is a hugely valuable resource. It's a great racecourse. It's 50 minutes from central London, and in 10 or 15 years when they build Crossrail 2, it could be as little as 20-25 minutes. So, you know, it's a huge resource. You've got millions and millions of people in the sort of catchment area. So I think the bigger question is, why has British racing not made more of this resource? What can it do to build on this fantastic racecourse that we have there and make a real success of it, rather than saying, what can we do? You know, let's sell it now, let's bank a couple of $100 million, which will be gone in 10 years time, and what will we have to show for it then? One fewer racecourse and the King George not at its proper home.
So would you be of the opinion that the current jockey club, really it's out of their remit to sell off something they've inherited and should be bequeathing to the future racing generations?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I'm a great believer in the idea that people who are in politics or in business often feel they have to do something because they have to justify their presence, and they love big projects, whether it's the government taking on big legislation or businesses selling off things so they can have money to play with. People at the top of organisations love being busy. They love having stuff to do, and I think this is a classic example of it. They've had a developer come along and say, we can give you so much money for this, we can give you hundreds of millions, think what you could do with all that money. And I think they've been blinded by it, frankly, rather than thinking about, you know, what's best for racing, what's best for racing fans, what's best for the King George, one of our very, very best races, and one that's absolutely has a treasured place in the sort of sporting calendar of this nation.
Okay, right, so we talked earlier before we did this interview about, well, working at the Racing Post now, and we talked about social media. Now, people are very vocal on social media about a number of things, and one of them is that the Racing Post as a paper is neutered because it has to keep its advertisers happy, namely big bookmakers. Now, how far from that is the truth?
Well, I can only speak personally in terms of what I write about and what I'm asked to do, and whether people believe it or not, I can't help, but I've never been told you can write this by my editor. I've never been told you need to go and write favourably about this part of the business or this company. I think, like any business, the Racing Post cannot go out and set itself up as an antagonist, as a pure antagonist. I think, you know, what we always see ourselves as is a sort of critical friend. You know, whether it's the bookmaking industry or racing itself, you know, we're not there to be a cheerleader, we're not there to be a critic either. We're there to support when appropriate and to ask critical questions when appropriate. And I think that's quite a responsible thing to do. But obviously the consequence of that is you're never going to please everyone, because, you know, for every person who wants you to be more supportive of the racing industry, and we've had plenty of critics on that front. It's not there's other people who want you to go out and say you know, why aren't you calling attention to this supposedly corrupt practice? So there's always a balance to be struck, and I don't think anyone at the Racing Post would ever claim that we get it right all the time, but we certainly strive to get it right. And I know personally, and from speaking to my colleagues, that everyone there has the right interests at heart, and that is, you know, to be good journalists writing pertinent and valuable articles.
So I think you've already answered the question in your previous answer, but have you ever pitched a feature that has been vetoed because of who it might upset?
I've only had one thing that was ever spiked, and it was a column about Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen warlord, who's a nasty piece of work, let me tell you. And the reason it was spiked is because I was sort of railing against his involvement in racing, but at the time he didn't actually have any horses in Britain. I think he had a few out in Dubai and stuff. So the point was made that it was perhaps not entirely relevant. But I've still got that column up my sleeve, and if Mr. Kadyrov ever comes back to British racing, he's going to get both barrels.
I was thinking more along the lines of bookies, not a Chechen warlord, so fair play. Have you ever been asked to write an article championing something that you were morally opposed to?
No, I've not. I've been asked to write articles about things which I have personal views on. I remember one of the first things that I did many years back, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. We did a pull-out looking at an anniversary of the liberalisation of betting shops, and one of the areas we focused on was FOBTs, because obviously since their introduction they had revolutionised the bookmaking industry and completely changed the sort of culture of betting shops. So I went along. I wasn't told what angle to take. I was just asked to go along to a betting shop and to play the FOBTs, frankly, for a day, to learn a little bit about their background and to the controversies around them. And you know, I was fairly junior in my journalism career then, and I certainly don't suggest that the piece I wrote was a stinging rebuke, but I came back and I wrote a piece which basically described FOBTs as random number generators, and talking about how it was quite sad in a way that people would sit there feeding money into them and potentially losing large sums of money about what was essentially just a computer terminal picking up a number from some warehouse somewhere. So I don't think, you know, that would be construed as any way a positive piece about FOBTs, and there was no issue with it. There was no issue whatsoever. I wasn't asked to go and, you know, paint a slightly more cheery picture of what these machines are. I've always been sort of given my head and allowed to write what I believe in, and you know, I've always appreciated that. Did
you end up with a few quid or not?
Do you know, I actually did make some money. It's the one and only time I've ever played FOBTs and I actually made money.